let's actually talk about some of the questions that were asked. Here's some of the questions I asked them, and then I'll talk about some of the questions they asked me. I asked things like this. If God exists, would he know something we don't about the reasons for the suffering of sentient creatures? What do you think the reasons for suffering are? So, Sanjay, do you understand what was trying to be accomplished with that question? Maybe you would have worded it different. I don't know if you remember much about their answer, but what do you think is sort of the validity of those kinds of questions in this context of this discussion in general?
I think that's an important question, especially with the debate topic. Does evil nullify God? The atheist has to establish that they're in some sort of epistemic position. That's a fancy philosophy word for in a position to know that there are certain kind of evils that are inscrutable, that are in principle not the sort of evils that God would allow for any good purpose. And the question is, well, how do you know that? I mean, in some cases, there are evils that we can look back on in our own lives, things that happened, a breakup, a loss of a job, even a dire health issue, something like that, where we can look back and we can see that it was painful, it was fearful, it was terrifying at the time. We thought it was breaking us down, but we look back and we see that it made us stronger. And if you believe in God, you might well believe that God allowed this to happen for some greater good in your life, and you can look back with thankfulness. In other cases, there are bad things that happen to us or bad things that happen in the world, and we can't say that we know why it happens. But that doesn't necessarily mean that in principle there's no reason why it happens or there's no good God providentially ordering the universe. The atheist has to establish that they know that these are inscrutable, superfluous, egregious, senseless evils. And so that was the burden on Randy and Jason, and they didn't carry that burden.
Do you think they understood that's what their task was to do?
No.
Yeah, see, that's what I find. I think sometimes people don't even understand what problems they have with their own worldview. What it is they need to defend, and so
I don't think that they got that at all. And the theist response, of course, is there very well may be reasons, or not reasons, but there very well may be times when we don't know, and the theist is not necessarily on the hook to explain God in every situation.
Interesting, yeah.
Yeah, and I don't think
that's helpful too to say that.
I don't think they did because Sanjay, do you remember at the end a professor who was not a Christian from a local community college came up at the end and he said, look, guys, the burden of proof is on you to show that there demonstrably could not be a reason, and I don't think you've shown that really at all. And they actually thought by his question the guy was a Christian. They sort of thought it was like a hostile questioner, but he wasn't. I actually know that he's sort of an agnostic.
No, I'm sorry, the burden is on you as Christians
to show there couldn't be a good reason.
No, the burden is on the atheist.
Yeah,
because it seems to be a fairly plausible assertion that it's possible that God has reasons that we don't know about. Can theism even say that God has reasons that we don't know about? Of course, theists have never said that we...
So what is Sanjay, you didn't like their answer. What is the best answer you've heard from an atheist to your point?
Well, I think that argument, that's called the evidential problem of evil, and I think that argument is inconclusive and is not a strong argument for atheism. It does provide some evidence for atheism, but having some evidence for something is not to have a conclusive demonstration or proof of it. You could be pulled over by the police because there's some evidence that that you look like the suspect. But if they find out that you have an alibi and there's the evidence is inconclusive, that wouldn't be good enough evidence to say arrest you or convict you or anything like that. So the evidential problem of evil, some of these apparently inscrutable evils might suggest to us that provide some evidence for atheism, but they actually have to demonstrate that it's impossible that God have reasons that we don't know.
Yeah, and if God is omniscient, and on Christian theism he is, it's almost like how could he not have a good reason that he knows that is morally sufficient? When we come back...
On the phone, we have Wade Austin Paget, who's a friend of the show. Had participated in a previous debate, not this one, but a previous debate, and had made a comment on this particular debate. And, Wade, we were going to ask you, can we read the comment that you posted, I think, on Facebook?
Oh, sure, go ahead.
So Wade writes this. Our friend Vocab is to be commended for the I'm not pronouncing it right, equanimity with which he dealt with a frustrating meeting. I'm an atheist, as you know, so am not brought to any stronger feelings with regard to the ideas of either God or Jesus. For those of us who work in our particular kinds of helping professions, Vocab exemplified a kind of tolerance for the bizarre that I know that Jeff is familiar with in his work. that I could not muster in the face of last night's almost hysterical atheist assertions, and I hope Randy will one day appreciate in the course of his own work.
Wade, like Ricky Ricardo used to say to Lucy, you got a lot of splaining to do. explain the quote to our listening audience, if you could.
I have to say I was really pleased. Jeff said that that was why he loved me, and I was really gratified. That was very nice. There was, what I'll add to that was at the end of that, it may have been near the end of the comment. I also had asked Sanjay how he felt about moderating that debate and whether or not he would do it again. And I don't think Sanjay actually gave an answer to that. I think I pretty much laid out how I felt about the atheist position in that debate. And I would clarify something. What we had done in our previous meeting wasn't a debate. It was really just a discussion, which is something that I very much prefer. The debate itself, the one we were talking about, it was something that I found really pretty unfriendly. And I did use the word hysterical in that. And it was hysterical. It was a lot of kind of scripted commentary, not necessarily on your part, because for your part, you were responding to a lot of invective. I mean, it was just a lot of kind of explosive, scattergun kind of stuff.
Well, Wade,
it was not friendly.
You had been the debater. Maybe you don't like to participate in debates. It would have had a different tone, I think, is what you're saying.
Absolutely, yeah.
So did you just not like the tone, or did you think the points that these fellow atheists made, fellow to you, were not strong?
I think the points that they made were not strong. In fact, I was the first person to ask a question when it came to audience questions. I don't think the way they define terms. I think the constant references to lions killing gazelles and baby deer burning the forests were overused, and then it did get hysterical. And they were just poorly utilized. The definition of the term unnecessary, and how that unnecessary really it kind of circled back to purposefulness, and probably would have played right into Vocab's arguments of purpose and teleology, where suffering was concerned. So it was just a kind of a malformed argument from the outset.
Let me just ask a question to Vocab. I mean, how, given Wade's description of kind of the hysteria, I mean, how was it being kind of in the midst of the maelstrom there?
Well, it's interesting. I think from like doing stuff on Mill, or sometimes going to the mosque and speaking to Muslims, witnessing to them as they come out of Friday afternoon service. And people the reason why I say those things is people get in your face and saying some strange or mean or rude or impolite things or whatever. Sometimes it seems really unprovoked, like you couldn't predict this kind of behavior. I think that's helped me sort of learn just to not really be bothered at all by it. I don't think I really was bothered, other than the sense of I was a little concerned about how much time was being taken, and at points where they were talking over each other, not talking over me, where they're actually talking over each other, I felt a little bit as if the audience wasn't being well served. So there was a little bit of that, but there was a few times where they did things where I actually looked around the audience to look for someone else smiling, because I said, someone has to be smiling out there, because this is, some of this behavior is you phrased it well, Wade. You said tolerance for the bizarre. So I felt okay. Those really were my concerns and considerations. Yeah.
Wait, sorry.
I'm sorry. Could I ask a question really quick? I mean, given what you've seen on Facebook, and we do have a lot of these discussions on Facebook, is this really something you wouldn't have expected in a conversation face to face?
It's interesting you said that. What you're basically saying is, based upon past behavior from these two gentlemen, would not this be the way I would expect to go? There's two considerations for that, I would say, at least. One is, I've seen a lot of times atheists be there's a lot of people, not just atheists, that are a certain way online and then are sort of very milquetoast in person or in these discussions. So I didn't know for certain how much of sort of the verbosity and boisterousness would carry over. I think especially with one of the gentlemen, it really did carry over. It translated well, if I could phrase it that way. So that's one thing. The other thing is, they weren't necessarily my first selection to do this, Wade. They're just the first two guys that said yes. I mean, I'm just frankly saying, and so I'm not saying I'm gunning for atheists because I'm learning a lot as I go as well, but I've been asking a lot of people, and they've all said no for whatever reasons, and finally, after almost a 9-month period of asking these two, they finally said yes, and so that's really what it came down to. We wanted to do it, and they're the guys who said yes. So I do commend them for saying yes.
Sure. Wade, you mentioned what you appreciate more, or what you lean towards more, is discussion. I mean, why do you think that's important for these type of for between Christians and atheists? Why do you use that term particularly?
I think what it leaves room for in terms of spontaneity. I mean, a lot of the things, the issues that come up in these kinds of conversations, there's not room for them in timed discussions. Mm-hmm. So what a lot of people come into with in-time debates are scripted speeches, essentially. Or if there are responses, if there are question and answer periods, they're scripted responses that leave almost no room for any improvisation, or friendliness for that matter. It's just bam, 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 and then you're done, and there's no feeling of resolution or even room for resolution.
Yeah, and I think Wade, your personality lends itself well to that. And when we did the thing with Omar, who was another atheist, you and myself, actually really wasn't a debate because we all agreed on the question, which was yes, Christians and atheists can be friends, and we did have little parts, mainly at the end, where we had differences as far as what we believed. Obviously, one's an atheist, one's a Christian. But one of the people who watched this debate actually said this: "Whoa, definitely a different atmosphere than when you debated Wade and Omar." Now, people just use the word debate, but we understand what you're talking about. I am very impressed and really appreciate the level of humility and respect Vocab shows in light of the atheist arrogance and disrespect in this debate. I wasn't reading the quote. Now that I read it, it makes it sound like I was just reading it so I sound good, but it wasn't. I was just trying to do a compare and contrast. Wade, let's keep you on for one more segment. The music's coming up. We've got another segment. It'll be about 5 minutes. I'd like to keep you on and maybe do a little bit of a compare, contrast, and say, do things have to be this way? And maybe we can even ask Sanjay, would you do it again?
One of the things I found helpful in what you said was, this idea of, look, there's ways in which we can engage in this that are more fruitful, that bring more resolution. If you don't mind me exploring that a little bit more in terms of, how would you want, how would you want people to engage in conversations on this issue? What are some of the things that you would want to be addressed and how they should be addressed?
You mean in terms of issues, or
yes,
how it's the ongoing issue that I know continues, for instance, on Vocab's Facebook page, and Sanjays continue with it off and on as well, is the abortion debate. That's one as well, and it's one that I don't think that I've seen you guys address necessarily in this format in terms of either discussion or debate on First Friday. But it certainly has gone on Facebook. And one of the things that I've seen with that issue specifically, as well as others, that's unfortunate on Facebook and more broadly on Facebook, is that it can get really heated and nasty in the same sense that, or maybe unfriendly is a better word, in the same sense that we were talking about with the First Friday debate, that people can just pick up and walk away from them. And, an analogy for that is I think people have this idea that Facebook is very much, if not the same, as sitting down in front of somebody in a cafe. And that if you're in a cafe having coffee with somebody and you just get up and walk away, that's a conversation stopper, obviously. People just don't do that, not normally anyway. But it happens all the time on Facebook. And we need to figure a way out, and maybe the way to do that is just to sit down face-to-face with people. We don't do that as much anymore. Facebook has been kind of a stand-in. So that's one way to maybe continue these conversations, that we just figure that out and just do that face-to-face.
Sounds like we got a whole show brewing here on social media and interpersonal relations with Wade Austin Paget. So Sanjay, he asked you, would you want to do this kind of thing again, sort of your thoughts. I'd like to maybe have you and Wade, if you guys want to chop it up for a bit. If you want to talk about anything he said thus far, Sanjay, the floor is yours.
Well, to the question of whether I'd do it again as a moderator,
I'd
be happy to. I think that some of the problems with this debate, for anyone who hadn't seen it, I know that it's posted online and they can see some of the things that we're talking about. And And I can understand Wade's frustrations as an atheist, wanting his side presented in a more cogent and coherent way. And even if you're not an atheist, if you have some interest in this, you want to hope for a good, clear debate. And at times it wasn't that. But I think some of the problems were just logistical. Having one of the two, first of all, kind of having it a little bit uneven, 2 versus 1, that can work. You don't normally see that, but I think on the unbalanced side, they needed to do a little bit of a better job of, as you said, they were talking over one another. That obviously doesn't serve their purposes at all. So that was weird. But having one person on Skype, I wondered if he couldn't hear us all the time. And I think he could, towards the middle and really towards the end of the debate, he really came unhinged. And so, would I ever moderate or participate in a debate with that individual again? No, absolutely not him. He had no business being in this debate. He has no business talking about these issues publicly. He doesn't know what he's saying. The other individual that was there, that was present, that could see people's body language. I didn't want to name names, but Jason, right. I'd be happy to. I mean, I got to talk to him afterwards, and that makes a big difference, being there in person. So it was some of the logistical issues, and one issue with Randy. He shouldn't be in debates on these questions, at least not now. And so, I'd be happy to. I think that they're fruitful, that they're interesting, that people enjoy them, that people learn from them. But obviously they can go wrong. And in this case, there were some things that didn't go quite right. I've never moderated before, so if you want to say that I'm not a very good moderator, I'll accept that criticism.
And certainly I had wondered how difficult it must have been, especially with somebody who might not have been able to hear you, to be able to say, hey, your time is up, stop, or finish your thought, and then, vocab can continue. But, it's got to be difficult one way or the other.
Yeah.
But there was a lot of that.
Yeah, and even if there's sometimes where he couldn't hear as well, because we did have him on Skype on the sort of Max Headroom style, for those who understand the reference, when I was given a statement, he could hear me and knew he wasn't supposed to go during those times, but for some reason could not refrain from that activity. And so often the engineers actually had to turn him down, and so you could actually see him with his hands waving around on the monitor screen, but no volume coming out. But thank you very much, Wade, for joining us. When we come back, we'll get a little more into the content and substance of the debate.
Let's start with that, Sanjay. Could you make the point that you thought that they could have made better?
Yeah, I think what they were going for is atheism's strongest argument, and that is what's called the evidential problem of evil. It's not the logical problem of evil, which is the old argument for atheism that isn't quite as popular anymore. The old argument for atheism purports to be just a knockout, 3-step argument against theism. Very, very straightforward, deductive sort of syllogism. And it goes something like this. Actually, Jason mentioned it at one point very quickly, but in the course of his talk, or the points that he was making, he really wasn't making this argument. He was making the evidential argument. But the logical argument is just that, first premise is something like, according to theism, God is supposed to be all loving, or according to theism, God is all loving, and so would want to prevent any evils. He wouldn't want there to be any evils. No good parent wants evil for their children that they love, and so a perfectly good God wouldn't want evil for us. So that would be the first premise. The second one is, according to theism, God is all-powerful and so could prevent evils. So given that he would want to prevent evils and could prevent evils, it seems to entail that he would prevent evils, but evils exist. Therefore, theism is false. That's called a reductio ad absurdum argument, to show that it's absurd because evil is real, and theists don't deny that evil is real. I mean, that's Eastern philosophy or Christian Science or something like that. It says it's an illusion. If you read the Bible, the biblical authors, the prophets and apostles and things, are very clear about the reality of evil. And so it seems to be something of a knockout argument against theism, and that was very popular for a long time. It was mentioned in ancient Greece. Early modern philosophers mentioned this. Well into the 20th century, people were making these arguments. But it's really a very cheap argument against theism, because it really oversimplifies what the theist is saying about the nature of divine goodness and the nature of God's power. And so there's a number of reasons that we could mention, but as I said, they didn't really argue that so much. The reasons that the theist would give in response to think that that's an oversimplified argument is to just point out that God could very well have certain providential aims for allowing some evil. He could have some soul-building purposes, and Jason mentioned this as well. There's also conceptions of free will, according to which God even though he's all-powerful, couldn't prevent some evils if he wanted to allow that kind of free will. So these are the sorts of responses that theists have given, and so the logical problem of evil really isn't on the map anymore. So atheists have moved over to not a deductive argument, but an inductive argument. An inductive argument is the sort of thing like a detective would do. A detective doesn't say premise 1, premise 2, therefore conclusion. A detective puts together evidence and comes up with the best theory to explain the evidence. And so the evidential problem of evil says, look at all these unexplainable evils. How do you explain these evils? And just piles them up. And then says, aha, you can't explain them, Mr. Theist. But the problem for the evidential cases we mentioned in our first segment is that we have to be in a good position to know that theism doesn't explain them, that they actually fall outside of God's purposes. And how would we know that? So, for example, this is how it might go. If I tell my children, I take my 2 boys and their room is messed up, and I tell them, go clean up your room. And it's just, their room is just entirely messy. And I come back in an hour, and the room is still just as messy. Things have been moved around, but they haven't been cleaning up the room. And I say to them, you haven't been cleaning up your room. They typically say something to me like, you didn't give us enough time. We've been working on it, but an hour is more than enough time. Now, I'm in a good epistemic position to tell them, I know you haven't been cleaning up your room. I know that. Why? Because I know what it takes to clean up a room that size. And I have good evidence, there's still a mess, and I know that they haven't been cleaning up the room. But here's the problem for the atheist. None of them have ever providentially controlled a world. They don't know what it takes. They don't know how much evil is too much evil. I know how much mess I should expect to see after an hour. Very little. How much evil should I expect to see in this world? I'm not sure. Perhaps God knows. Now, the atheist is telling us he knows we shouldn't expect the sort of evils that we see. But I want to know, Randy and Jason, how do you know that? And they never answered that question, ever.
Right. All this talk about good and evil is reminding me of a clip from Spaceballs, which I shall now play.
Now you see that evil will always triumph because good is dumb.
Dark Helmet. Remember Dark Helmet?
Good to have some clips working.
That was an awesome, just a little cute transition. But okay, so comments about what's been said thus far.
If it's can Stardust oppress Stardust, right? I mean, can there be too much oppression of if we're all just Stardust, right? What is there such a category as of oppression or evil or violence when you're talking about?
It doesn't make sense for the atheist to use that term, I don't think, within his worldview. But I think it's fair for the atheist to say,
within your worldview,
within your worldview,
yeah.
you think there's just such a thing. So it doesn't make sense in your own.
I see. Okay.
Well, Sanjay, they didn't answer the question. But if, in your experience, you heard the best possible response from an atheist, what would it be?
Well, I think, as I've read the sort of evidential arguments from evil, and as far as I know, there is no conclusive evidence.
And you said earlier this was their best argument, you thought?
Yeah, and the best argument for atheism is inconclusive. I don't think there's any good rational grounds for which somebody can say there is no God. I don't think that you can make a good rational case for it. I think you can make a rational case for that there is a God. I think possibly one could be, depending on what they understand and what arguments they're aware of, they could be rational to be an agnostic and say, I don't really know. But I can't think of any good reason, because the atheist is not saying I don't know. The atheist is
absolutely
saying
not.
There's no God. That's the claim of atheism, and that's what I mean by atheism. If you don't mean that, then maybe you're an agnostic. But that's what they were trying to defend, that evil does nullify God. That means there is no God, and they didn't come anywhere near to showing that.
Yeah, now, we talked a little bit about some of the, sort of chaotic aspect to the debate, and at the same time, I do want to say Jason Short and I did a sort of a follow-up at South Mountain Community College. A local professor was in the audience, actually liked what Jason and I were saying. That's and how we were going back and forth. He invited us to speak to 2 days' worth of classes, so all of his religion and all of his philosophy classes, and he teaches like 5 or 6 classes, and so we were able to go, and it was clear there was no animus or anything like that between us. We went out for lunch, the atheists always pay. Whenever I go out for lunch with an atheist, they always pay for me.
I need more atheist friends.
Yeah, seriously. It's like hardly been one time. So,
or maybe that's because you're just cheap.
Maybe. I think they're trying to out-Christianize me, and they might be doing a good job as far as that goes. So, hey, keep it up, guys. But in all fairness, Randy and Jason wrote me the next day and said very kind things. Randy said, look, I was just a little amped up to the debate, and sometimes it was hard to hear. So, okay, we'll take that. There's some aspect of that we can understand. But he said, hey, thanks for the debate, Vocab, and really thanks for the opportunity. I really enjoyed it, and thank you for making it happen. Let me know where I can send a donation for any cost that might have been associated from the event. Really, I mean it. So he was very glad, very thankful that he could do it, and so I appreciate that. And Jason said the same thing. Thanks for putting these in the debate together, having us out, and so on.
That's great.
So yeah, I think that's a good thing.
How would what brief comments would you give about your time at the South Mountain College? I mean, you guys talked about all that stuff, didn't you?
Yeah, I mean, the professor went on his Facebook the next day and talked about what we talked about. We discussed such things as evil, animal suffering, determinism versus free will, salvation, revelation, the gospel, the relationship between faith and reason, and various issues in sexual ethics. And the next day we discussed, do atheists have a ground for morality, the problem of evil, sexual ethics, abortion, and zoophilia, and whether or not atheists and Christians can be friends. We talked about everything.
Oh, my goodness.
And there was some very strange things that were said there, but overall the students were involved and interested, and I was glad we could have the opportunity to do it.
Maybe for another time. Wade mentioned that we hadn't talked about abortion. Is that something maybe that'd be a topic for another debate or discussion if he prefers?
Yeah, we haven't had sort of the philosophical type discussion about it. We talked about images in the abortion debate, and I've done some stuff with Jeff Durbin, but we haven't done any of those sort of, I don't know, slower, higher level type discussions. So I would like to either do those in a proper debate context or on the show sometime, yeah. But those are some of the things to talk. But it went well, and yeah, I mean, it was interesting. There was, in that context, Jason was more sort of polemically forgiving and not timid, but less sort of assertive or certain. And I think overall it made it more profitable and helpful.
Can I point out something that I thought was interesting? Maybe you picked up on this too.
Sure.
They kept hammering you for basically giving the theist response. It's that God may very well have reasons. And sometimes we find in our lives, one philosopher writes about how when he was a kid, he couldn't understand how his older brother didn't want to spend the summer with him fishing and hunting and these sorts of things. It was inexplicable to him. It seemed an inexplicable evil that his older brother wouldn't go along with him on these things. And when he got older, he discovered girls himself, and he realized what the greater good, what the greater attraction was for him for not, and so he points out, when I was younger, I wasn't in a good position to know or to understand. Couldn't it be that God is in a great position to know and understand things that we don't? That's the answer that I heard you giving. And they kept hammering you on, oh, you're saying we don't know. You are resorting to mystery. You're not giving an answer.
Yeah, cop-out was what they said.
Cop-out, something like that. Now, when they were pressed to give an evolutionary explanation to their moral claims, at a couple points, they said, we can't explain everything.
Right.
We don't know. And I think that's, in some cases, that's a fair response. Everybody's going to, at some point, have to say, I just guess I can't explain everything. But it was so funny that they didn't see the irony there, that someone could very well say, there's a cop-out. Now suddenly you don't know. I wanted to...
And Vocab didn't hammer him on that, you're saying?
No, he didn't.
He's too polite.
Right.
Well, I don't know if that's why. Maybe I'm just not sharp enough.
But it would have been a good point
sarcastic.
to raise that. Now, I think the difference is with God, in principle, we have reason to think that we may not be able to know. Maybe God, as Calvin would say, desires to keep some secrets from us. As Calvin would say, what God tells us is for our good, and what he doesn't tell us is for our good. Is that even possible? Sure, it's possible. So what's the atheist argument? Show us that it's impossible, and that's their burden.
Yeah, definitionally, I mean, biblically, Deuteronomy 29:29, secret will of God, revealed will of God, and you have the sort of definition of who God is. He's all good, he's all powerful, he's all knowing. It's almost like, how could that God not have a morally sufficient reason? Mm-hmm. By the definition, he sort of would. But yeah, my main sort of thing to keep on pressing them on was, and Jason even said this. This is sort of a quote from my notes he wrote. He said at one point, "Evolution is brutal, and the losers are wiped out." And I was asking him from within that framework to even explain how he can ask the question of evil, how it's really a problem. Now, I would then say, okay, so from within my worldview, here's some of the answers. And I talked a little bit about what we might call character building, God's morally sufficient reason that is unknown to us. And I gave the example of the cross, for example, and cited some passages related to that. So we can sort of start to speculate, and sometimes it's been made known to us what these reasons for these spectacular sins, as have been called, are. But final comments or questions, guys?